She left me with a basket of groceries, jarred preserves, a loaf of bread, a bottle of wine that rattled pleasantly in the bag. There was also a small envelope pinned to the lid of the guest book. Inside, in a neat hand different from any in the book, was a single line: "For emergencies, the generator is behind the shed. Do not open the cellar door. If you have to, knock first." That was how the house began to divide itself. Everything sensible lived on one side: kettle, matches, a labeled fuse box. Everything uncanny hinted at a soft edge where the world thinned: the pond, the cellar door with its rusted iron ring, the guest book heavy and waiting for signatures like a ledger. I took a photo of the pond, as if proof might be useful later. The image on my phone was the same as my eyes: glass, tree line, no movement. Taking the picture felt childish, an attempt to make the scene both portable and undeniable. The first night I boiled water, uncorked the wine, and read the book until my eyelids grew sticky. Around dinner I signed my name, one neat script, and wrote where I was from, the dates, the way the light fell through the east window. The ink dried slowly, dark as a bruise on the page. A few lines down, someone had written in a hurried scrawl about listening, and then struck a line through 3 words. Another entry, dated years earlier, read only, "Remember to water the geranium." The diversity of voices made the house's history feel like a chorus you could step into, some reverent, some careless, some amused. Day 2 was a wide, slow thing. I walked the property and memorized the way the pond swallowed my reflection. The sky and my face mixed into a single borrowed photograph. The trees kept you from understanding how far the road was. At the house, the world closed in kindly. I found the shed behind the house. The generator, an unloved metal thing, sat under a tarpaulin. The cellar door was inset into a slope beside it, its iron ring pitted with age. I knocked, an idle, polite knock, because the typed note had suggested it. Nothing answered. I felt foolish for knocking at a door that clearly had not been used in years, but the gesture made me feel less alone. At dusk, a bird, an impossible loud presence, rattled from the tree line. I was in the kitchen when the porch light blinked, came on, and then dimmed as if someone had tested it and settled it to the exact warmth of old bulbs. Linda had left a small lamp on the counter. I moved it closer to the window and sat with my wine, listening to the house breathe. That was the thing. The house breathed. Floors settled, the radiator pinged, the pond made a soft slurring sound, as if it had its own half-sleep. I woke to the sound of something very small and very wet on the porch. For a second I thought it was the cat of a neighbor, or a raccoon pawing at the wicker.
Her voice suggested explanation and baited me with a casualness that felt rehearsed. I should have told her to leave, to go to Linda, to be sensible. I did none of those things. Instead, I crouched, and my phone slipped from my fingers and thudded into the reeds. The cold splash felt obscene. I laughed at myself, an animal sound, and reached after the phone. When I put my hand to the water, the surface stung, and the world tilted a little. I had the vague sense of being watched from everywhere at once by leaves and old stones. "Don't go in," she said, and then, as if correcting a lesson, "Follow me." Her voice had the soft, implacable quality of someone reading instructions aloud. I did not follow her into the water. I did follow her around the pond, a few steps away, because she had, by habit, the patience of someone who knows how to make people move where she wanted them. Once she reached up and took the edge of my sleeve with fingers that were colder than the wind. There should have been nothing in my chest but sensible alarm. Instead, I found that I was listing reasons to be generous. Perhaps she was a guest's child, perhaps Linda's neighbor, perhaps someone who needed help. All the while, the book sat at home, closed and trusting. When she vanished, it was not with a flourish, but like a candle being covered. One moment she sat on the stone lip with her small hands clasped. The next, there was only the space where she had sat, the water showing only reeds and the crooked sky. My flashlight trembled in my grip. I called her name out loud, a thin, ridiculous thing in the dark. The sound came back to me from the tree line and did not return with an answer. When I looked back toward the house, the porch light was on. In the window I caught, for a beat, the reflection of a lantern moving as if someone had stepped onto the porch and carried it. I couldn't see a figure. The reflection did not match the steady porch lamp. It was a swinging, patient circle of light, slow as breathing. I told myself it was a reflection from the pond, some trick of angle and glass. I told myself many things that night. I walked back to the house and signed the book again, as if the act could reset whatever small wrongness I had permitted. My fingers traced the lines I had made earlier, and for a moment I thought the ink had bled beyond the letters. The page felt warm, as if someone's palm had been left there minutes before. I told myself it was the heat from my own hand. At 9:13 p.m. precisely, something knocked at the front door. It was 3 soft, patient knocks, each measured like a metronome. The sound was so ordinary, it was almost a joke. Someone at the door. My first thought was Linda, returning to check the house. My second thought blinked into place. Knock 3 times, step back. Did the rules say that? They did. Rule 2, with its unbidden lantern and the polite retreat. The knocking came again, as if to answer my hesitation.
At 11:59, I heard the first soft knock on glass, not from outside, but from within the room where the guestbook lay. A small, precise tapping, as if an invisible finger had been reading along the lines and paused to point. The clock chimed 12 with a sound that was too slow to be a standard mechanism. It vibrated in the cups of my ears like a memory being forced toward the attention of my body. I had choices then laid out before me like cards. I could do what the scrap said and stay watching until dawn. I could go outside and search for whoever had left the prints by the pond. I could call Linda and tell her that the rules were beginning to feel like something more than rules. Each option felt like a confession. I poured another cup of coffee and turned to the book. My name sat where I had put it, but when I traced the ink, it left a faint track like a groove in the paper. The page browned at the edges as if it had been exposed to breath. Under my entry, a new line had been written in a hand that looked like a child's and an old woman's handwriting all at once. We watched. We kept you. Come back and tell us. A soft scraping began at the edge of the kitchen window. Something large and careful was moving outside where I could not clearly make it out. Antlers against bark, maybe, or branches being coaxed into new positions. The sound made the spine of the house flex. I stood and walked to the window, because of course I did. Curiosity is a vice and a teacher, ruthless in its lessons. In the glass, I didn't see antlers so much as I saw their suggestion, something tall and wrong at the limit of vision. For a heartbeat, I met a pair of eyes that were not my own, and then the thing stepped away so that only the reflection of a lantern remained, swinging slow and patient. The rules had names, and the names had power. I closed the curtain and sat back down, hands folded like someone who had decided a simple act could be prayer. My phone vibrated with a message from the reservation system. "Thank you for choosing Willoughby House. Please remember to sign the book. Safe travels." The message felt obscene in its cheer. At 1:03 a.m., the porch light went out. A bell of silence unfolded, heavy and complete. The house listened to its own quiet, and then from the porch a small, dry sound. 3 knocks, step back, 3 knocks, step back. I could hear the pocket where I had folded the scrap of paper pulse like a small heart. The night held its own rules now, and I realized with a clarity that was almost relief. The house was not haunted in the way stories told. It was organized. It asked things of people. It recorded. It took and measured and sometimes returned. The ledger was not a registry so much as a spine, and I had placed my signature upon it. The guest who never checked in, I thought absurdly, would be someone for whom the book never accepted an exit. The knocking slowed, and the porch light returned, diffuse and patient.
Those rules hummed under my skin. I closed the book and left it on the table where it could be easily found. Outside, a figure stepped back from the tree line, and for a second I thought I recognized the shape. Child, woman with lantern, something with antlers. But the night folded them into suggestion. I wrapped my shawl around my shoulders and sat with my hands folded in my lap, listening to the house count me and keep me and wait. The clock's hands neared the hour that everything in the guest book circled like a ritual marker. I had signed my name, and the house now expected me to stay awake and answer its small, polite demands. When a sound from the pond, wet and precise as a bell, cut through the night, I realized I had not truly been alone since I arrived. The ledger on the table had been keeping its own company. The house, in its slow, measured way, was preparing something. I could hear its patience as clearly as a pulse. I read the rules again, under the lamplight. They were simple, functional, friendly as a neighbor's warning. But each number pressed on a different part of my expectation and found purchase. The last line, in a small, almost affectionate hand, concluded, "Do not be ashamed to sign twice if you must. We like the neatness of edges." The porch light swung once more, and then stood as steady as a held breath. In the glass, I saw a lantern that had not been there a moment before, and in its oil-lighted halo, I saw a figure step forward into the trees. The figure carried nothing but the slow attention of someone who had been practicing the gesture for a long time. I closed the curtains and sat back down. The house, it seemed, had already decided my role. I felt something like a ledger closing around me. Outside on the porch step, no scrap remained, only a damp ring where a footprint had been. The pond showed nothing but sky, and the thin ripple of distant movement, the way a heart moves beneath thin skin.
The night stretched on, and the rules, written in ink and folded into practice, waited for me to obey them. I had checked in. The house would keep its record. I could feel, with a peculiar intimacy, the machinery of hospitality beginning to study me. At 3:04 a.m. there was a whisper at the kitchen door. 3 knocks. Step back. I listened and answered by keeping my hands visible and my light bright. The guest book lay open on the coffee table like a map I had not yet learned to read, and the pond answered the moon with a single, patient, clarifying ripple. I thought of the scrap photograph in my pocket, and of the child by the water, and of Linda's practical smile. I thought of the typed note, "Do not open the cellar door. If you have to, knock first." The house was full of instructions. I would have to choose which to follow. I would have to decide, at some point, what price my attention would pay. Somewhere in the house a page turned, and the night waited for my answer. The page turned again on its own, a soft, paper-breath sound that seemed to come from the book on the table. My name sat on the line where I had left it, the ink still a little damp where the pen had hesitated. Beside it, someone had traced a second mark, neat, patient, as if to tidy the edge of a ledger. The rules had said it was allowed. The last line had winked at me like a neighbor. I had signed twice without meaning to. My hand had moved before my thought had caught up. The house, it seemed, approved of neatness. I rose and padded to the hallway on bare feet. The radiators hissed, a warm, indifferent sound. The house smelt of old linen and boiled tea and the slow mineral tang of pond water drawn into stone. In the parlor, a clock ticked as if it had been wound in deliberation, each exhale of its mechanism a small domestic prayer. The porch light steadied its halo against the glass. Beyond it, the trees stood like witnesses, and I had the sense that each of their limbs had been taught to keep its place. I thought of the cellar door, because the note in my pocket had made the thought unavoidable. Linda had written that line with the kind of shorthand frankness she'd used on shopping lists and appointment cards. Do not open the cellar door. If you have to, knock first. Not never. Not under any circumstances. A concession, a loophole, an invitation. Linda's handwriting was practical. It knew the calculus of human curiosity. The kitchen floor felt cool beneath my soles. I took the candlestick from the sideboard and, without lighting it, set it down at the foot of the narrow steps that led to the cellar. The door was a low slab of oak with iron fittings, and a ring of rust where fingers had long ago left prints. When I put my palm to the wood, the grain was unexpectedly warm, as if the house had been expecting touch. The rules had been teaching me to be awake, to answer, to keep my hands visible. For the first time since the tapping began, I understood that obedience here might be both shield and hinge. I knocked because the scrap had begged courtesy. 3 small, measured taps. Polite, patient. They sounded absurdly like the knocks from the pond. They sounded like the knocks that had woken me. The sound from inside answered by turning the air colder, as if the walls had inhaled. There was a pause long enough for the kitchen clock to mark it with a single, careful click. Then, from below, a correspondingly small knock. 3 knocks, step back. It could have been an animal. It could have been water shifting against stone, the settling of foundations. It could have been anything rational.
but whatever answered me belonged to the same grammar as the house: ritual, measure, and a reluctance to arrive unannounced. I waited with my palm on the iron ring and felt for a brief, ridiculous moment that the ring might belong to someone else, that some hand had shaped it and left its warmth for me to find.
Another, deeper, more animal, whether I had the right to be here at all. The rules did not forbid descending. They forbade certain kinds of openness. They advised knocking. I had knocked. The house had answered. That was how these conversations began, with small courtesies. The rest, what the house wanted in exchange, was a slower curriculum. The cloth was lighter than I expected. When I drew it away, the lamp caught a circle of polished bone and iron, a small thing like a locket, but not shaped for a neck. It hummed faintly, an inner sound that was almost remembered music. Around its edge, someone had carved neat numerals, and beneath them, a name I knew without knowing why. The child's name from the photograph. My fingers closed over it, and the room rearranged. The jars seemed to lean, the shelves inhaled. The lamp burned with a steadier hand. Somewhere above, the house counted me again, and the ledger on the table had shifted so that another line gleamed, as if ink had been laid there by an invisible pen. "You found it," the voice said. "Good. The house likes tidy hands." I wanted to ask how the locket had come to be here, whether the child in the photograph had ever slept in these rooms. I wanted to ask Linda why she had left the note and what she had known. Words lined up and fell away. Instead, I said, simple and true, "Who are you?" There was a pause, a soft clink like the settling of a cup. The voice answered, "Someone who keeps the count. Someone who learned the patterns. Someone who," it hesitated against the syllable "waits," "made sure you would come when the book called your name." The idea that the ledger had called me felt absurd, then inevitable. My signature shone in a private light, an enrollment that could not be fully retracted. The locket warmed under my palm. "Why did Linda warn me?" I asked. "Why not tell me more?" Because she could not unname what she had seen. Because there are things that cannot be explained without bending the seams of what the house remembers. Because she thought she might be able to keep you from needing the cellar at all. I felt a sudden sharp tilt of pity for Linda, a practical woman who had expected to keep dangers at arm's length. I thought of the shopping list economy of her handwriting, and imagined her writing that single caution on a scrap, as if it were the last act she could perform to preserve another's order. Footsteps creaked above us, ghosted across the floor like an interrogative. I heard then from the stairwell something else, a whispering that could have been the house closing its attention, and the pond answering with a single patient ripple. Outside, the night held its composition. There were, in that moment, at least 2 other presences accounted for: the figure on the porch and the voice in the cellar, both observed with the precise courtesy of old guests. "I need to know what it does," I said. The words were an admission as much as a command. "The locket was heavier than I had guessed. "You will know in time," the voice said. "First, you must agree to the keeping." Agree? My laugh was brittle. What does that mean? A fold of shadow moved at the edge of the alcove, and when it parted, a paper lay there. Thin, a torn column of ledger paper with a single rule written in small, careful script. It read, "Whoever takes must leave. Whoever leaves must remember." "The house counts both ways," the voice added. "It is hospitable in that it gives and in that it keeps. It will not be cheated." The cellar felt suddenly like an accounting room. The jars, the old toys, the child's mended sleeve, all of them became entries against some vast, patient balance. I understood, with a cold clarity, that my curiosity had been expected, and that curiosity would be tendered for a price I might not like. I had already paid one small part of it in ink. The ledger had circled my name. To step away now without acknowledgment felt like leaving a debt unpaid. My hands tightened around the locket. In the lamplight, a tiny hinge opened, and a miniature photograph, no larger than a coin, sat within it. The child's face, sunlit, eyes bright, as if the shore had thrown them that light. Under the child's photograph, scrolled in the same neat, practical hand Linda had used elsewhere, was one more line. Sign twice. Keep watch. Someone moved above my head, slow and deliberate, as if pacing. The porch light swung and steadied. The rules, having become dialogue, began to sound less like instructions and more like obligations. I had a moment to choose. To leave the locket where it lay and close the cellar and pretend that the night's summons had been a misread signal. Or to accept that taking the thing tied me to the house's order and required me to begin keeping some count of my own. My fingers curled, and I closed the locket around the photograph. The click was a small, emphatic punctuation. The voice exhaled something that might have been satisfaction. Above us, the floorboards sighed, and the house resumed its calm enumeration. "Very well," the voice said. "Then keep watch. The pond will tell you when a new one comes. The porch will tap when an old one returns. Keep the light bright. Keep your hands visible. And remember, do not open the cellar door without knocking first." I could have laughed then, at the circularity, at the ceremonial language applied to what felt like a household chore. I did not. The locket warmed against my palm like a living thing. I tucked it inside my coat, against the photograph I already carried, and began the climb back up the stairs, as if rising through a long, measured prayer. When my head cleared the kitchen threshold, the house seemed unchanged, as if it had not been holding its breath at all. The guest book lay where I'd left it, my double signature awaiting the neatness it preferred. The porch light shimmered its steady halo. Beyond it, the trees watched without accusation.
A ponde senteu single, small ripple, as if in acknowledgement. Na tábua, beside the book, the rules had shifted by one line. Someone had written in a hand both precise and oddly tender, "Watch well, and do not be ashamed to ask for help." Outside, a figure moved in the tree line, a lantern held like a question. It took 3 soft knocks on the kitchen door. Step back. I stood with the lamp in my hand and thought of the child's photograph and Linda's practical smile and the ledger's neat appetite for names. I had crossed into something that kept accounts differently than I had ever been coached to keep them. The house had given me a thing, and, in exchange, wanted a posture, attention as currency, wakefulness as stewardship. I set the candlestick down and forced my hands to remain visible. The door was not yet opened. The porch light halo made a ring around the glass, and the dark beyond it held the silhouette of the figure steady. The rules hummed under my skin like a chord that refused to resolve. I opened the door. 3 small steps came forward, and then paused on the threshold, the figure lowering a lantern. The light washed their face, and for a second the world simplified. It was a child, older than my photograph suggested. Hair wet as if from the pond, eyes the pale green of water thinned by sun. Antlers, thin and clean as bone, curled from their head like a crown grown in a season no calendar kept. They smiled with the blank politeness of someone who had learned to be a good visitor. "You signed twice," they said, as if remarking on the weather. "We like neatness here." Their voice had the same patient cadence as the one in the cellar. Behind them, the tree line waited with the soft attention of an audience that did not blink. I had a dozen questions, and none at all. The lamp trembled between us. "Who are you?" I asked again, though I no longer trusted the strictness of that word. They stepped in, closing the door on the night. The house held its breath around us, and then, in the small domestic way that seemed both absurd and sacred, exhaled into its rooms. "We are guests," the child said. "We are the ones the ledger remembers when the world forgets to look." They set a small thing on the table, an object like a pebble and like a coin, worn at the edges. It matched the locket's weight in my palm of my hand. For a moment our fingers brushed, and the lamp made a shy pool of light that trembled where the oil met air. The child added, "The house will teach you its grammar if you will let it. But remember, all hospitality asks for a witness." Outside, the pond blinked once, slow and certain. The porch light steadied. In the kitchen, the guestbook waited, patient as a judge. I placed my hand on the open page, feeling the indent of my own ink, and understood that to be awake here was not only to observe, but to be observed in return. The rules had brought me a contract in the shape of a night. I had signed it twice.
Somewhere within the walls, a page turned, and the ledger added another entry in a hand that made my name look like a small, tidy knot. The house, having received my answer, settled into the room as if it had always belonged to us both. I kept watch that night as the pond blinked and the lantern swung, and the small figure with antlers told in careful, fragmentary sentences of other nights like this one, of lost things found, of names returned, of people who had once been expected and had not answered. The stories were small and domestic and terrible in their gentleness, as if the house meant to teach mercy through the steadiness of its counting. Dawn arrived, not with a proclamation, but with the faint corrosion of blue at the edges of the glass. The guestbook lay open, and, beneath my name, another line had been added, neater than mine, as if an invisible clerk had passed by in the night and made the ledger conform to order. I traced the new mark with my fingertip, and felt the locket warm against my breast, like an insistence. There would be much to learn. The house had already begun to instruct me. The language of knocks, the geometry of weights, the price and gift of vigilance. Linda had tried to warn me in shorthand. The cellar had taught me the cost of curiosity. The child with antlers smiled and said simply, "There will be visitors yet." Outside, the pond held a single light that did not blink, but rather burned steady, as if it had decided to stay. The trees watched. The house counted our small, careful breaths. When the knock came again that evening, more urgent and familiar than the polite insistences of the night, I found my hands already visible, and the guestbook open, and my pen in its cradle. The book had become less like a map and more like a mirror. The person at the door waited until I answered. Their eyes were not unkind. They held a scrap of paper in a fist and a photograph pinned to their lapel. Another child, another shore. The ledger on the table would accept this new name with the same neatness it had shown me. The house would make space for them, record them, teach them the rules, and expect their watch. I closed the book before the page could lift on its own. Outside, the pond responded with a slow ripple, too deliberate to be wind, too patient to be chance. In a house that tracts its guests like seasons, I finally understood that hospitality here wasn't kindness. It was a kind of accounting. I walked to the door, feeling the rules settle into my pulse like a second heartbeat. With my hand on the knob, I signed one last time, not on paper, not with ink, but in the air itself. Not a name, an agreement. A quiet acceptance of the work the house expected, to observe, to remember, to keep. The latch gave way. The house pulled us both into its long, attentive circuitry. And for the first time since I arrived, I felt its attention settle on me fully, steady, methodical, almost tender.